Hello, this video is for my freshman level students. This is Miss Jones, and I've been having some technical difficulties. So, I do apologize for not coming out with a weekly video last week, but this one will definitely cover what we did last week and what we're doing this week. So let's go ahead and click our module page and get started. Okay, you're going to see our 10th and final module for this year, and it's a poetry module. It's one that I made myself, so I hope you guys really like it. Okay, if you click the first page of this unit, you're going to see a brief introduction. It talks about why we study poetry, why it's important. It introduces our essential question, which is, what is poetry, and in what ways can it be used as a tool to promote self-expression? This is a question you all will be able to answer by the end of this year. Okay, your objectives moving forward is to understand poem structure, to develop a deeper understanding of poetry, to develop critical thinking skills, and to understand that reading poetry requires a different set of reading strategies. And so listed below are the Common Core state standards I'll be teaching you, as well as the ELD state standards. Now, if you click on the next page, you're going to see a brief glossary of terms. Now, this is going to be a very brief poetry unit. We're not going to be able to dive as deeply as I would like. So I did include a huge list here of important poetry terms that I think that you should familiarize with at least once. It'll help you in your future classes, and it'll also make you better at discussing poetry. If you go to the next page, you'll see our brief introductory lesson on poetry. Okay. And so if you go through the slides presentation, you'll be able to learn what is poetry, how can poetry be performed, what are the qualities of poetry, what kind of shapes does poetry come in. For example, this William Carlos Williams poem is an example of free verse, and it is very short and brief, but it's also very meaningful, and it takes you to a time and a place. Okay, William Carlos Williams writes in his poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens." And so this isn't a very impactful poem, but it definitely takes you to a countryside that was just showered with rain. And I don't know about you, but I can hear the chickens clucking, and I can smell the wet from the rain. And it just takes me to a time, and it takes me to a place. So I hope you guys like that poem. I also want you to watch these two videos below. Teda does a wonderful job explaining what's so wonderful about poetry. In this first video, it talks about what makes a poem. And in the second one, this talks about a few qualities that we see in poetry and ways that poetry is made more meaningful, depending on the rhyme and the rhythm that's involved. Now, if you go to the next page, you'll see our first activity for this poetry unit. It's an interpretation activity. And so when we interpret poetry, we're trying to understand what the poem is about. And so you'll see this video, and it has 3 different artists creating a video with their own interpretations of a Walt Whitman poem titled A Noiseless Patient Spider. And even though they're making videos about the same poem, you're going to see that they have 3 very different artistic representations as to what this poem should look like. And you're going to do something similar. Okay, not with the Walt Whitman poem, but with this newer, more contemporary poem titled The Book of Revelation. Okay, this is an excerpt from the poetry collection by Morgan Parker titled There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce. And I'll go ahead and read the Book of Revelation to you right now. My therapist says something, and my core is dark and the surface of my planet too. She says many creative people, and I can see a beautiful day if I tried. She says peace is something people tell themselves. So again, like that William Carlos Williams poem, this is a very small poem, but it's got a message behind it. And I'd like to see what message you can come up with. Okay, there are no wrong answers on this one. Understand that poetry is art, and like any art, you are free to interpret it however you want. You can interpret it whatever seems right to you. And so a text box will open up at the bottom of the page, and you can continue on. The first poetry activity that we're going to be doing that has you writing poetry is a blackout poetry assignment. Now, this is very fun, especially for you crafty people out there who like art projects. The way to create blackout poetry is to find a text It can be an article. It can be a page torn from a book. Or it can be one of my examples that I have down here. There are two Google Docs here that you can use. And step 1, you need to find a piece of text to use. Okay? Step 2, you need to go through and you need to pick out the words that work best for you. Okay? Don't read the article right away. It might help if you just scan and look for those big anchor words, those words that have a lot of meaning and a lot of impact. Look for those words that jump out at you. And then you'll find that that will guide your direction of your poem. Okay? Realize that some articles and passages don't work. Okay? You can move on and find another one. You also have to make sure that your poem is read from left to right and top to bottom. It's going to be confusing for your reader if you start from the bottom and move up. And so looking at these examples up here, okay, the first example, whisper louder, accept new life with gratitude, but filled with fear. What did become or what would become? Okay, it's very short, sweet, and to the point. Even shorter is this one right here. Never apologize for manifesting your dreams. Okay, that kind of reads like a fortune cookie. And then I really like this one right here because the artist chose to make a painting, a drawing, a doodle out of their blackout poetry. They write, a flawless sky, sunk in the sand, a mind clouded with shooting flames. Okay? I'm really excited to see what kind of poetry you guys can come up with. Now, if you choose not to, take a piece of paper and block out your words by hand, you can use these Google Docs down here. Just simply, select the text that you don't want. Okay, and then what you'll do is you'll come up here to the top where you see the 3 dots, and you'll look for the highlighting tool, and you'll just highlight the words that you don't want to be part of your poem. You'll highlight that in black. And so when you're done, okay, you'll find that you have some blackout poetry. And it's okay to black out parts of a word. Like, for example, say I want to say abandon every speculation instead of abandoned every speculation. I can just block that out too. Okay, that's how you do it. Now, another way that you can do it, if you're not quite sure where your poem is, okay, you can highlight your poem first, maybe in yellow. See that? You highlight it in yellow first. Then, when your poem is finished, you can come in, do the blackout poetry. And you can keep it highlighted in yellow when you're done, or you can, get rid of the yellow highlight. It's up to you guys. But that's just an example of how you would do it, if that makes sense. And then you can just turn that in. Either a picture or the Google Doc. It's up to you. Now the next activity that we're doing this week, we're going to learn about haikus and limericks. Haikus are really fun because they are simple examples of poetry. You might remember that we played with haikus earlier this year at the very beginning of class. It's a simple Japanese-style poem that's made of 3 lines. It has 3 sentences. And the first line is made of 5 syllables. The second line is made of 7 syllables. And the last line has 5. Okay, and here's an example of, there are a few examples here of haikus. Okay, this one, Over the Wintry by Natsume Soseki. Over the wintry forest, winds howl in a rage, with no leaves to blow. Okay, oftentimes we see with haikus is that they relate to nature. A lot of them talk about nature. We have this one by Ezra Pound, who chose to write his haiku in 2 lines instead of 3. He writes, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Okay, so he chose not to use the traditional 5-7-5 line style, but all the syllables are there. Okay, we have Katsushika Hokusai with A Poppy Blooms. And if you read my description down here, Katsushika Hokusai writes a powerful haiku that translation cannot accurately capture. In it, he compares a written poem to a blooming poppy. He uses imagery of the spring season to describe his writing process. And so you see, he's comparing 2 very unlike things, writing poetry and blooms. He writes, I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. So those are just a few examples of haiku, but I do have one more example that I wanted to show you. You know, it's really important that when you make your haikus, you follow the traditional 5-7-5 format. But, you know, after you leave my class someday, if you feel like writing poetry, just understand that it's okay for you to break the rules like Jack Kerouac here. Okay, Jack Kerouac argued that because English sentence structure is entirely different than Japanese, Western haikus should simply say a lot in 3 short lines in any Western language. But still, many Western authors and English teachers alike still favor the 5-7-5 break in their poems. But anyways, in The Taste of Rain by Jack Kerouac, he writes, "The taste of rain, why kneel?" Okay? So that's how you break the rules when you're writing haikus. Now, the other form of poetry that we're learning this week are limericks, and limericks are really fun. They're very silly. They follow a specific rhyme scheme. The first 2 lines rhyme, and then the next 2 lines rhyme with each other, and then the last line is going to rhyme with the first 2 lines. And so when we're talking about rhyme scheme, this is going to follow what's called an A, B, B, A format, meaning the first 2 and the last line rhyme, and then the third and the fourth line rhyme. And so I have an example right here from the great Shel Silverstein. In his poem, My Beard, okay, this is what a limerick sounds like, and it kind of has to follow this silly, whimsical kind of style. He writes, "My beard grows to my toes, I never wears no clothes, I wraps my hair around my bear, and down the road I goes." And you'll notice that these other examples of limericks kind of have that same rhythm. They kind of have that same bounce to it. A flea and a fly and a flew were in prison, so what can they do? Said the fly, "Let us flee, let us fly," said the flea. So they flew through the flaw and the flew. That was by Ogden Nash. This next example of a limerick right here, you may have heard it before, by Edward Lear. He writes, "There was an old man in a tree who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, 'Does it buzz?' he replied, 'Yes, it does. It's a regular brute of a bee.'" Okay? But you know what? Sometimes, like I said, in poetry, people break the rules. Typically, limericks are supposed to be funny, they're supposed to be silly, but we have a very serious limerick right here in Self-Reflection by Michael R. Birch. He writes, "She has a comely form, and a smile that brightens her dorm, but she's grossly unthin when seen from within. Soon all the campus will mourn." And so this is an incredibly sad poem with an incredibly serious tone. And what the poet is doing here is they're describing a young college student who struggles with her self-image. And the final line suggests, with this line, "Soon all the campus will mourn," that because of her insecurity, she ends up committing suicide. So, you know, there are many ways to write haikus and limericks, but if you look at this activity right here, let me go ahead and make a copy of it. I'm going to have you practice writing haikus. And so if you follow the directions, you're going to choose 3 of the following topics in this word bank, and you're going to come up with your own haikus about nature. Okay, it needs to follow the 5-7-5 format. So you'll write your 3 haikus right here. Now I understand that this might be really hard for us because with distance learning, many of us haven't been to the Arvin campus yet. So if you're not quite sure how to write a haiku about Arvin or Arvin High, you can just write a haiku about home. I'll allow that. But if you have been learning on campus with us, I encourage you to write a haiku about Arvin High School. You're going to write it right here. You're also going to practice with some limericks. And so these are very fill in the blank. There once was a blank from blank. All the while she hoped for blank. So she blinked and she blinked, blankety blinked, blankety blankety blinked. So you can just fill in the blanks and finish limerick 1 and limerick 2 on your own. And then I'd like to see you try to write your own limerick down here on the bottom box. Okay? So that's one of the assignments we're doing this week. The next one that we're going to do on Wednesday is we're going to write acrostic poetry. Now this is really fun. Acrostic verse works when you spell letters or you spell words using every line of the poem. And you can see these examples right here. We have a poem about summer and a poem about winter. Now this acrostic example has each of the first letters of each line spell out the word summer. You guys can see it right there. Okay? Summer. Swimming under the hot sun, making memories with friends, more free time, endless smiles, ruined by school. Okay? Now, you don't have to start each line with a letter from a word. You can also connect each line by putting the word in the middle of your lines. So for example, endless wind, the W for winter, doesn't happen until we get to the word wind. Endless wind, dripping icicles, no school, falling temperatures, everyone in sweaters ready for warmer weather. See how it spells winter? And so you guys are going to practice writing acrostic poems as well. Let me go ahead and open this up. Okay, so we already read the poems about summer and winter, but you guys are going to come in here and represent the other seasons for spring and autumn. So just like our summer poetry, you're going to do a poem where the first letter of each line spells spring. And I have it started off for you. So many beautiful flowers poking up through the dirt, ready to brightly bloom. And then your next line has to start with an I. And then your next line needs to start with an N. And then the last one needs to be a G. You need to spell out spring. Now this next one's going to be a little hard to do because you're going to be spelling autumn, but you're going to be spelling autumn in the middle of your poem. Now it is possible to start each line with the word. For example, your next line, although some may call it fall, since the leaves do fall upon the ground. You can start your next line here after the T, but you can also include that as part of the middle of your line, as long as you spell the rest of autumn. Now here's another word bank here, and what you're going to do for the next two poems, the next two poems, is using the word bank, you're going to choose one of these topics, and you're going to write your own acrostic poem in the boxes below. So for example, you want to write a poem about soccer. Your first line can start with an S, your second line can start with an O, a C, an E, and an R. Okay? And then down at the bottom, I want you to make one last acrostic poem, but this time I want you to use your name. So for example, if I were doing an acrostic poem for me, my first line would start with J. Joyful songs in my heart. The next line would be an O. Off key, but I can't help that. I'm not the best singer. N. No one around to hear my bad singing. E. Endless verse. I sing forever. S. Songs in my heart match my world. Okay, now I honestly I didn't write that ahead of time. I honestly just pulled that out of thin air. But you get the idea, right? This poem right here, okay, it spells my name right there. So if your name is really short, if it's only like 3 letters, if you're an Amy, it might help to do your last name. Try to make the most out of this. Have fun with it. So that's acrostic poetry. Now the last assignment that I have you guys doing this week is for free verse poetry. And so that's not the right example. I might have to fix this. Anyways, free verse poetry. This is a better example of free verse poetry right here. This is William Carlos Williams again. And he writes, this is just to say. Okay, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. Okay? And so with free verse poetry, you're just allowed to express yourself in writing. Okay, it doesn't need to rhyme. Okay, the meter doesn't need to bounce in the same way. You're free to write what your heart tells you to write. And so all I ask is that you make this example of poetry at least 8 lines long. Now, it doesn't need to be an 8-line stanza. You can break it down into different stanzas of different sizes. But yeah, I want to see your heart on the page here, okay? So I hope you guys, I hope this helps. If, of course, you have any questions, you can reach out to me for help. Also, don't forget that the last day for late work is coming up on June 7th. Please turn in the following assessments by that time, and I will greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much for watching this nearly 20-minute long video, and have a good day.